The cloth was rough, coarse linen that scraped against the sensitive, ruined skin of her cheek with every breath she took. It smelled of stale flour, of wood smoke, and of her own fear. Ilara kept her head down. She always kept her head down. The world she knew was limited to the 3 feet of floorboards directly in front of her boots. Scuffed leather boots that had seen better years, stained with the gray dust of the bakery and the mud of the streets she tried to avoid. Inside the bakery, the heat was a physical weight. It wasn't a comforting warmth. It was a suffocating, heavy blanket of air that tasted of yeast and burnt sugar. The ovens roared in the corner, great iron beasts that demanded constant feeding. For anyone else, the fire was a tool. For Ilara, the fire was a memory. Every time the iron door clanged open, every time the orange glow spilled out across the floor, she flinched. Just a micro movement, a tightening of the muscles in her back, a phantom pain that shot through the nerves of her face, the nerves that were dead and yet, somehow, remembered everything. Thump, fold, turn. Her hands worked the dough. They were strong hands. Hands that didn't look like they belonged to a monster. They were pale, dusted with white flour, the fingers long and capable. If you only looked at her hands, you would think she was just a woman, just a girl of 22 trying to earn a living. But nobody looked at her hands. They looked at the hood. They looked at the heavy gray veil that hung from her forehead to her collarbone, obscuring the left side of her face completely. The half-ghost, the children called her. The burnt witch, the older ones whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. But she could hear. The veil hid her face. It didn't block her ears. She heard the bell above the door jingle, the sudden draft of cold October air cutting through the humidity of the kitchen. She didn't turn around. She knew who it was by the heavy, confident footsteps. Mr. Henderson, the owner, and the silence that followed him told her he wasn't alone. The rhythmic thump, fold, turn of her kneading stopped. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic bird trapped in a cage. Ilara. His voice was flat, devoid of the usual gruff kindness he used when they were alone. This was his public voice, the voice he used when he needed to prove to the town that he was a good, God-fearing man who didn't harbor abominations. She turned slowly. She kept her chin tucked into her chest, the veil hanging still and heavy. Mr. Henderson stood there, wiping his hands on a rag that was greasier than the floor. Behind him stood Mrs. Gable, the mayor's wife, a woman who wore silk in a town built on coal and cattle. She was holding a loaf of bread as if it were a dead rat. She says, Henderson cleared his throat, looking everywhere except at Ilara. She says she found a hair in the loaf. Ilara looked at the bread. It was perfect, golden, crusty, warm. There was no hair. Mrs. Gable's nose wrinkled, a gesture of pure distilled disgust. It's not just the hair, Mr. Henderson, the woman said, her voice high and sharp like breaking glass. It's the hygiene. How can we be sure, with her condition, that the sickness isn't seeping into the food? The weeping sores, the infection. Ilara felt the blood drain from her face. There were no sores. The scars were old, they were silver and red and twisted, melted wax over bone. But they were dry, they were healed. But truth didn't matter here. Fear mattered. Disgust mattered. Ilara started to speak, her voice raspy from hours of silence. Don't! Henderson cut her off. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had been fighting a slow tide and had finally decided to just let himself drown. I can't do it anymore, Ilara. The complaints, the whispers, business is down. He reached into his pocket and pulled out 3 silver coins. He placed them on the wooden table. They clinked, a cold metallic sound that echoed in the sudden silence of the bakery. Take it, it's a week's wages, go. Mr. Henderson, please, she whispered, the desperation clawing at her throat. Winter is coming. I have nowhere. Go, Mrs. Gable shouted it. She stepped back, clutching her shawl as if Ilara had lunged at her. Get out! You bring bad luck on this whole street. You're cursed. Ilara looked at the coins. Then she looked at Henderson. He had turned his back. He was looking into the fire of the oven, staring at the flames so he wouldn't have to see the human being he was destroying. She took the coins. Her fingers trembled, brushing the wood of the table one last time. She untied her apron, letting it fall to the floor in a heap of white canvas. She walked past them. She felt Mrs. Gable shrink away, pressing herself against the shelves to avoid even the brush of Alara's skirt. The bell jingled again as she opened the door, and then the world changed. From the heat of the bakery to the biting wet slap of the rain, it was pouring, a freezing, relentless deluge that turned the dirt road into a river of black mud. The water soaked through her veil instantly. The wet linen clung to her face, sticking to the ridges of her scars, outlining the deformity she tried so hard to hide. She gasped, the cold shock making her shudder. She stood there on the step, the water running down her neck, soaking her dress, freezing her to the bone. Behind her, the lock of the bakery door clicked, a heavy, final sound. She was out, cast aside like a broken tool. The town stretched out before her, gray and hostile under the storm clouds. Windows were shuttered, lanterns were dimmed. There was no shelter here, not for her. She gripped the 3 silver coins in her fist until they bit into her palm. She had to move. If she stayed here, she would freeze. Or worse. The sheriff would find her loitering. There was only one place left, a place the townspeople didn't go, a place they whispered about with the same fear they used for her, the Stone Ranch, high in the foothills, where the beast of the mountains lived. They said he shot trespassers on sight. They said he was mad, but as Alara stepped off the curb, her boot sinking deep into the freezing mud, she realized something terrifying. She didn't care if he shot her. At least a bullet was warm. She pulled her shawl tighter, lowered her head against the wind, and began to walk. The secret of what lay in that house, and the man who waited behind its heavy oak doors, was about to change everything. But before we follow her into the dark, before we see what happens when a monster meets a beast, if you are searching for the stories that others are too afraid to tell, make sure you subscribe now. The journey is long, and the night is just beginning. The mud was hungry. That was the only way to describe it. It wasn't just wet earth. It was a living, thick, black paste that grabbed at her ankles with every step. Squelch, drag, pull. The sound was wet and heavy. Alara's boots were old. The leather had cracked 2 winters ago. And now, the freezing sludge seeped right through, wrapping around her toes like icy fingers. She couldn't feel her feet anymore. They were just heavy weights at the end of her legs, numb blocks of wood that she had to force forward by sheer will. The town had faded behind her. The warm, yellow glow of the windows she was never invited to look into, had disappeared into the gray curtain of the storm. Now, there was only the road, or what was left of it, here. On the outskirts, the cobblestones gave way to rutted dirt tracks carved by wagon wheels and hardened by neglect. The wind howled. It didn't blow. It screamed. It came tearing down from the mountains, carrying the scent of pine and snow, cutting through her thin wool shawl as if it wasn't even there. She shivered violently. Her teeth chattered, a rhythmic clicking sound inside her skull that she couldn't stop. She clutched the 3 silver coins so tight her knuckles were white. Those coins were her life, but out here, in the dark, they felt useless. You couldn't eat silver. You couldn't burn silver for warmth. She looked up, squinting against the stinging rain. Ahead, the road began to climb. The incline was steep, winding up into the dense tree line where the shadows were absolute. That was where the Stone Ranch lay. The locals didn't go up there. They told stories in the tavern, stories about Silas. They said he was a giant. They said he had killed men with his bare hands during the war. They said he hated the sight of people so much that he had built a wall of stone around his heart and his land. A monster. That's what they called him. Alara let out a dry, humorless laugh that was instantly swallowed by the wind. A monster seeking a monster. It was almost poetic. She took another step. Her knee buckled. She stumbled, catching herself on a rough pine trunk. The bark scraped her palm, stinging, but the pain was distant. She was so tired. The cold had moved past the shivering stage. Now, it was just a deep, heavy drowsiness. A voice in the back of her head whispered that it would be so easy to just sit down, just for a minute, just to rest her eyes against the trunk of the tree. No, she pushed herself off the tree. If she sat down, she would die. She forced her eyes open, scanning the darkness, and then she saw it, a shape, Geometric, unnatural, a fence. Not the flimsy wooden fences of the town, but a barrier of heavy, split-rail timber, dark with rain, and beyond it, the outline of a house. It was massive, built of gray river stone and dark timber. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress. There were no lights in the windows. It sat there, silent, imposing, a sleeping beast in the rain. She had made it. She stumbled toward the gate. Her legs felt like they were filled with lead. 10 steps. 5 steps. She reached out, her hand trembling, to touch the rough wood of the gatepost. "Hello?" She tried to shout, but it came out as a broken whisper. "Please!" The wind roared in response and drowning her out. She tried to push the gate open. It was heavy, too heavy. Her strength, the last reserves of adrenaline that had carried her from the bakery, evaporated. The world tilted sideways. The gray sky spun. The wet ground rushed up to meet her. She didn't feel the impact. She just felt the cold mud against her cheek, pressing against the veil. She lay there, half in and half out of the boundary line. The rain beat down on her back, a rhythmic drumming that sounded like a lullaby. Her eyes fluttered closed. The darkness took her, and the last thing she heard, over the roar of the wind, was the sound of a heavy door creaking open somewhere in the distance, and the heavy, thudding footsteps of something large approaching through the mud. The smell hit her first, earthy, sweet, the scent of dried alfalfa, of old leather oil, and the deep musk warmth of large animals. It wasn't the sharp metallic smell of the rain. It was the smell of life. Ilara gasped, a sudden intake of air that burned her dry throat. Her eyes snapped open. Above her, there was no gray sky. There were wooden beams, thick hand-hewn timbers disappearing into the shadows of a high ceiling. A lantern hung from a hook nearby, its flame dancing behind the glass, casting long, flickering shadows that seemed to breathe on the walls. She wasn't in the mud. She was lying on a pile of straw, covered by a heavy, scratchy wool blanket. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of her mind. She sat up, the blanket falling away. Her hands flew to her face. The veil, it was still there, dried now, stiff with the residue of the rain. But it was there. She clutched the edges of the fabric, pulling it tight against her neck, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "It's still on." The voice came from the darkness. It was deep, so deep it felt like a vibration in the floorboards rather than a sound in the air. Ilara froze. She turned her head slowly toward the corner of the stall. There, sitting on an overturned crate, was a mountain. That was the only word her mind could supply. He was massive. Shoulders that spanned the width of the stall door, a chest like a barrel, legs clad in dark denim stretched out before him. He was whittling a piece of wood with a knife that looked dangerously sharp in the lantern light. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The sound was rhythmic, hypnotic. He didn't look up. His face was shadowed by the brim of a battered Stetson hat. All she could see was a jawline covered in dark stubble, and a mouth set in a hard, grim line. Silas, the beast of the stone ranch. Ilara scrambled backward, her boots slipping on the straw, until her back hit the rough wooden wall of the stall. I'm sorry," she stammered, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean to trespass. I fell. I'll go. I'll leave right now." She tried to stand, but her legs were still weak. She stumbled, bracing herself against the wall. The scraping stopped. Silas looked up. For the first time, she saw his eyes. They weren't the eyes of a madman. They were gray, cold, flat, and utterly unreadable, like the surface of a frozen lake. He didn't look at her veil. He didn't look at the scar she knew was hiding beneath it. He looked at her hands, specifically at the calluses on her fingers. "You have flour under your nails," he said. It wasn't a question. It was an observation. Ilara looked down. Despite the mud, despite the rain, the faint white dust of the bakery was still embedded in the creases of her skin. She swallowed hard. "I was a baker. Until today." Silas slowly folded the knife. The click of the blade snapping shut echoed in the silence. He stood up. The action seemed to take forever. He just kept rising, and rising, until he towered over her, blocking out the lantern light. Ilara flinched, bracing herself for the blow. She expected him to yell, to tell her to get her cursed face off his property, to drag her back to the road, but he didn't move toward her. He walked to a hook on the wall and grabbed a heavy iron skillet. He held it up, inspecting the bottom. "My last cook quit," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Ran off to the city. Said the silence up here was too loud." He turned his gaze back to her. "I don't care about your face." Ilara stopped breathing. "I don't care why you wear that rag on your head," he continued, his tone as dry as dust. "I don't care who you are or where you came from." He took a step closer. "I care about two things. Can you cook? And can you stay quiet?" Ilara stared at him. The wind howled outside, battering the walls of the stable. But inside, it was perfectly still. This wasn't charity. This wasn't kindness. It was a transaction. He wasn't offering her a home because he pitied her. He was offering her a trade because he needed her. And for the first time in 5 years, someone was looking at her and seeing a worker, not a monster. She slowly lowered her hands from her veil. She stood up straighter, ignoring the trembling in her knees. "I can cook," she whispered. "And I don't have anyone to talk to anyway." Silas stared at her for a long second, evaluating. Then, he nodded once. "Kitchen's in the main house. You start at dawn." He turned and walked out into the storm, leaving the heavy stable door swinging slightly in the wind. The kitchen was a cavern of stone and shadow. It was vast. Everything about the stone ranch was built for giants. The counters were slightly too high. The cast-iron stove was a black behemoth that looked like it could swallow a whole cord of wood, and the table was a slab of oak thick enough to stop a bullet. Ilara stood in the doorway. She had slept in the stable, curled up in the straw like a stray dog. She had washed in the horse trough, the freezing water shocking her awake, scrubbing the mud from her hands and neck, but the veil remained. She had pinned it tighter, securing the cloth so not even a sliver of skin would show if she moved too quickly. Silas was already there. He sat at the head of the table, a mug of black coffee steaming in front of him. He didn't look up when she entered. He was reading a ledger, his finger tracing lines of numbers with slow, deliberate precision. The silence stretched. It was heavy, thick, suffocating. Ilara took a step forward, the floorboards creaking under her boot. "Mr. Silas," she started, her voice barely a whisper. He stopped reading. He didn't turn his head. He just waited. "You need to know," she said, the words rushing out before she could lose her nerve. "It's not just a scar, it's bad. The town, they say I'm bad luck, they say looking at me curdles the milk." She paused, waiting for him to flinch. "If you want me to leave, I understand. I don't want to bring trouble to your house." Silas slowly closed the ledger. He turned on the bench, the wood groaning under his weight. He looked at her, not at the veil, at her posture, at the way she held her hands clasped in front of her like a prisoner awaiting a sentence. "There are 3 rules in this house," he said. His voice was low, gravel grinding on gravel. He held up a finger. 1. Breakfast is at dawn. Dinner is at sundown. If you're late, we don't eat. He held up a second finger. 2. What happens on this land stays on this land. I don't talk to the town. You don't talk to the town. He held up a third finger. 3. You stay out of the east wing. The door is locked. It stays locked. He lowered his hand. "Did you hear me mention anything about curses? Or bad luck? Or your face?" Ilara blinked, stunned. "No, sir." "Then stop talking about it." He pointed a thick finger toward the pantry. "There's bacon in the cold box, eggs in the basket, flour in the bin." He turned back to his coffee. "I take my eggs over easy. Don't break the yolk." The interview was over. Ilara stood there for a heartbeat, her mind reeling. He didn't care. It was terrifying and liberating. She moved. She went to the stove. This she could do. She grabbed the iron poker and stoked the embers, feeding kindling into the belly of the beast. The fire roared to life. She found the bacon, thick slabs of cured pork that smelled of hickory smoke. She laid them in the skillet. Sizzle. The sound was aggressive, loud, familiar. The fat rendered, turning clear and liquid. The smell filled the kitchen, chasing away the scent of dust and old stone. Ilara's hands moved with a rhythm she hadn't felt in months. Crack the egg, snap, drop it in, hiss. Watch the white turn opaque. Watch the yolk tremble but hold. She plated the food: 2 eggs, 3 strips of bacon, a slice of toasted bread. She carried the plate to the table. Her hands shook slightly. This was the test. If the food was bad, the deal was off. She placed the plate in front of him. She stepped back, retreating to the safety of the stove, clutching her apron. Silas picked up his fork. He cut a piece of bacon, ate it, chewed slowly. His face was a mask of stone. No expression, no nod. He cut into the egg. The yolk ran, rich and golden, mixing with the bacon grease. He took a bite. Ilara held her breath. The seconds felt like hours. He took another bite, and another. He ate the entire plate in silence. He wiped the last of the yolk with the bread and ate that too. Then, he stood up. He picked up his plate and walked to the wash basin. He turned to look at her before he walked out the back door. "Lunch is at noon," he said. And then he was gone. Ilara let out a breath she felt like she had been holding since yesterday. She looked at the empty plate in the sink. It was the cleanest thing she had ever seen. He hadn't said thank you. He hadn't smiled, but he had eaten every crumb, and in that empty plate, Ilara saw something she hadn't seen in a long time. A future. The routine became her armor. Days at the Stone Ranch didn't pass in hours. They passed in tasks. Dawn. The fire needs wood, the coffee needs grinding, the dough needs to rise. Noon. The stew needs stirring, the bread needs baking, the floor needs sweeping. Dusk. The dishes need washing, the embers need banking, the silence needs enduring. Ilara became a ghost in the house. She learned the rhythm of the floorboards, which ones creaked, which ones groaned, and which ones were silent. She learned to move without sound. She woke up an hour before Silas. She washed her face in the dark, running a wet cloth over the twisted, shiny skin of her left cheek, feeling the ridges and valleys with her fingertips, but never looking in the mirror. Then, the veil. Always the veil. She pinned it tight. By the time Silas walked into the kitchen, his boots heavy on the stone, she was already a faceless shape by the stove, her back to him, her hands busy. They barely spoke. "More coffee," he would say. "Yes, sir," she would whisper. "We need salt," he would state. "I'll add it to the list," she would reply. It was a strange, cold dance, but it was safe. For the first time in years, Ilara felt safe. There were no whispers here, no children throwing stones, no women crossing the street to avoid her shadow, just the wind, just the work, just the man who ate her food and never asked to see her face. But safety is a fragile thing. It can be shattered by something as small as a reflection. It was a Tuesday. The sun was bright, unusually bright for November, streaming through the high kitchen windows in sharp, dusty beams. Ilara was polishing the copper pots. They hung from a rack above the island, heavy, expensive, neglected for years before she arrived. She scrubbed them with lemon and salt until they burned like fire. She reached up to hang the largest stockpot. It was heavy. Her arm strained. She lifted it high, the copper catching the sunlight, and there it was, the reflection. The bottom of the pot was polished to a mirror finish, and in that curved, distorted surface, she saw herself. The veil had slipped, just a fraction, just an inch, but it was enough. The red, melted skin around her eye, the way the eyelid drooped, the patch of scalp where the hair refused to grow. It looked monstrous in the copper, distorted, expanded, horrifying. The witch, the word echoed in her mind, screamed by 1,000 voices from her past. She gasped. Her grip faltered. The heavy pot slipped from her soapy fingers. Clang. The sound was deafening. It hit the stone floor with the force of a gunshot, spinning, wobbling, the noise echoing through the empty house like a bell tolling for the dead. Ilara froze. Her heart stopped. She scrambled to pick it up, her hands shaking so bad she couldn't grip the handle. I'm sorry," she whispered to the empty room. But the room wasn't empty. She felt the vibration before she heard the steps, the heavy, rapid thud of boots coming from the hallway. Silas never ran, but he was running now. The kitchen door flew open. He stood there, chest heaving, a rifle in his hand. His eyes were wide, scanning the room for a threat. "What happened?" he barked. "Who's here?" He thought they were under attack. He thought someone had broken in. Ilara was on her knees, clutching the pot to her chest like a shield. She pulled the veil down frantically, hiding her face, hiding the monster. "It was me," she sobbed, the tears coming hot and fast. "I dropped it. I'm sorry. I'm so clumsy. I saw. She couldn't finish. Silas lowered the rifle. He looked at the pot. He looked at her trembling form on the floor. The tension slowly drained from his shoulders. He walked over to her. The boot stopped inches from her knees. Ilara flinched, waiting for the anger, waiting for him to tell her she was useless, that she was too broken even to wash a pot. But he didn't yell. He knelt down, one knee on the stone floor. He was so big that even kneeling, he towered over her. He reached out and took the pot from her hands. Gently, he set it on the floor. "It's just a pot, Ilara," he said quietly. I scared you," she whispered. "You startled me," he corrected. "I thought—" He stopped. He looked toward the window, his jaw tightening. "I thought the war had come back." He stood up, the moment of vulnerability gone as quickly as it had come. He looked down at her. "Are you burned?" "No, sir." "Good. Then pick it up. Lunch won't cook itself." He turned and walked away, but at the door, he paused. He didn't look back. "And Ilara?" "Yes, sir?" "You don't need to polish them that bright. We aren't trying to impress anyone." He walked out. Ilara sat there on the floor. She touched her veil. He hadn't asked what she saw. He hadn't asked why she screamed. He had just checked if she was hurt, and in that moment, the ghost in the kitchen felt a little less transparent. The pantry was running low. The flour bin scraped the bottom when Ilara scooped it. The coffee tin was light. The sugar was gone. Supplies meant town, and town meant danger. Ilara watched from the kitchen window as Silas hitched the black mare to the wagon. He moved with efficient, brutal grace. He checked the wheels. He checked the harness. Then he checked his hip. He adjusted the holster of his revolver. He never went to town without it. Most men carried guns for show, or for snakes. Silas carried his like a part of his body. He looked up at the window. For a second, their eyes met through the glass. He didn't wave. He just nodded once. A sharp dip of the chin that meant, "Stay inside, lock the door." Then he climbed up, snapped the reins, and the wagon rolled down the driveway, disappearing into the tree line. Ilara locked the door. She slid the heavy iron bolt home. Then she went back to her work. But her mind went with him. She knew what awaited him down there. The stares, the whispers, and now, because of her, the questions. The general store smelled of sawdust and peppermint. It was the hub of the town, the place where news was traded faster than currency. When Silas walked in, the conversation died. It was like someone had sucked the air out of the room. 3 men were leaning against the counter. Old Man Miller, Sheriff Brady, and Caleb, the blacksmith's son, a loud-mouthed bully who thought the world owed him a favor. Silas ignored them. He walked to the counter, his boots thudding on the wood. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and slapped it on the counter. "List," he grunted. The shopkeeper, a nervous man named Mr. Abernathy, took the paper with trembling fingers. "Right away, Mr. Silas. Right away." He scurried off to the back. Silas stood there, a statue. He could feel their eyes on his back. He could feel the tension coiling in the air like a snake ready to strike. "So," Caleb's voice broke the silence. It was slurred. He'd been drinking early. "Is it true?" Silas didn't turn. "Is what true? That you got a pet monster up there at the Stone Ranch?" The room went deadly silent. Even the flies seemed to stop buzzing. Silas slowly turned his head. He looked at Caleb. "I have a cook," Silas said. His voice was low, dangerous. "A cook?" Caleb laughed. A harsh, ugly sound. "That ain't a cook, Silas. That's a curse. My wife says she's got half a face. Says she looks like something the devil spat out." Caleb took a step forward, emboldened by the whiskey and the silence of the other men. "You know what folks are saying? They're saying it ain't right, harboring a freak like that. It ain't natural. She'll sour the milk. She'll bring the blight to the crops." Silas turned fully now. He faced Caleb. He didn't reach for his gun. He didn't need to. He just stood there, letting his sheer size and the cold, dead weight of his stare do the work. "Mr. Abernathy," Silas called out, not looking away from Caleb. Yes," the shopkeeper squeaked from the back. "Add a box of bullets to my order." .45 caliber. Caleb swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed. Is that a threat? Caleb whispered. Silas took a step closer. He leaned in until he was breathing the same air as the bully. It's a shopping list, Silas said softly. But if you come up my road to check on my pet, you'll find out what I use them for. He straightened up. She cooks my food. She cleans my house. She minds her business. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the sheriff, then Old Man Miller. Which is more than I can say for any of you. Mr. Abernathy hurried back with a crate of supplies. Silas paid in gold. He picked up the crate with one hand. He walked to the door. As he pushed it open, the bell jingled cheerfully, a stark contrast to the violence hanging in the air. He stopped. She has a name, Silas said, his back to the room. It's Ilara. And the next man who calls her a monster will answer to me. He walked out. The door closed. Inside the store, nobody moved for a long time. Silas climbed into his wagon. His hands were steady on the reins, but his jaw was clenched so tight his teeth hurt. He knew what he had done. He had drawn a line in the sand, and in this town, lines were meant to be crossed. He looked up toward the mountains, toward the ranch. He had defended her. He had put his name, his reputation, and his safety between her and the mob. And the terrifying question that haunted him as the wagon rattled home was simply, why? Why risk everything for a girl he barely knew? Maybe, just maybe, it was because he knew what it felt like to be looked at like a monster. What would you do? Would you stand against your entire community to protect a stranger? Or would you keep your head down to survive? Tell me in the comments. The kitchen was warm, too warm. Ilara had been baking all morning to keep her mind off the empty driveway. Bread, pies, biscuits. The counter was covered in flour and dough. She was exhausted, but she couldn't stop. If she stopped, she would think about Silas. She would think about the town. She would think about the torches she saw in her nightmares. She reached for the heavy cast-iron kettle on the back burner. It was boiling. Steam hissed from the spout in an angry white plume. She needed to move it to the sink. She grabbed the handle with a towel, but her mind was elsewhere. She was looking out the window, watching for the wagon. The towel slipped. Her bare skin touched the scorching iron. Shh! The sound of searing flesh. Pain, white-hot and blinding, shot up her arm. Ah! She gasped, jerking her hand back. The kettle tipped. Boiling water splashed over the edge, cascading down the front of the stove and onto her apron. The steam billowed up, a sudden, suffocating cloud. And in that instant, Ilara wasn't in the kitchen anymore. She was back there. 5 years ago, the burning house, the roar of the flames eating the walls, the smoke choking her lungs, the scream of the child trapped in the crib. Fire! Fire everywhere. She fell back, scrambling away from the stove, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. No, no, please! She was screaming at the memory. She was clawing at her face, tearing at the veil, trying to get the phantom smoke out of her eyes. The kitchen door burst open. Silas. He had just walked in from the barn. He saw the steam. He saw her on the floor, writhing, screaming. He dropped the crate of supplies. Apples rolled across the floor. He rushed to her. Ilara! He reached for her. Don't touch me, she shrieked, curling into a ball, hiding her face in her arms. Don't look! It burns! It burns! She was lost in the flashback. She didn't see Silas. She saw the fire. Silas froze. He saw the red welt on her hand. He saw the water dripping from the stove. He understood. He didn't grab her. He didn't shout. He moved with a terrifying calm. He went to the sink. He pumped the handle. Squeak. Splash. He soaked a clean cloth in the icy water. He walked back to her. He knelt down. Ilara, he said. His voice was different. It wasn't the gruff voice of the master. It was the voice of a soldier, a commander, firm, grounding, an anchor in the storm. Ilara, listen to my voice. She was sobbing, rocking back and forth. It's just water. The fire is out. You are safe. He reached out and took her burned hand. She flinched, trying to pull away. Let me see, he commanded. He didn't let go. He held her wrist firmly but gently. He laid the cold, wet cloth over the burn. The relief was instant. The cold shock cut through the panic. Ilara gasped, her eyes snapping open. She looked up. Silas was right there, kneeling in the flour. His hat was gone, his eyes were locked on hers. And for the first time, she realized her veil was askew. It had slipped sideways in her struggle. Her left cheek, the ruined cheek, was exposed. The melted skin, the twisted scar tissue, the horror she hid from the world. She froze. Terror, colder than the water, and washed over her. "Don't look," she whispered, tears streaming down her good cheek. "Please, don't look at me. I'm a monster." She tried to pull her hand away to cover her face. Silas didn't let go of her hand. He didn't look away. He didn't flinch. He didn't recoil in disgust. He looked at the scar. He studied it, not with morbid curiosity, but with recognition. "You're not a monster," he said quietly. He lifted his other hand. For a second, she thought he was going to touch her face. She held her breath, but he didn't. He reached for the collar of his own shirt. He unbuttoned the top button, then the second. He pulled the fabric aside. Ilara stared. There, on his chest, just below the collarbone, was a scar. It was jagged, ugly, a starburst of puckered flesh where a bullet had entered, or maybe shrapnel. It was old, but it was deep. "Shiloh," he said. 1862. He looked back at her face. "Fire doesn't make you a monster, Ilara. It just means you survived something that tried to kill you." He released his shirt. He gently pressed the cold cloth against her hand again. "Now," he said, his voice returning to its usual gruffness. "Let's get some salve on that burn before it blisters." He stood up. He offered her a hand. Ilara looked at his hand, then she looked at his face. He had seen her. He had seen the worst of her, and he was still standing there. Slowly, shakily, she reached out. She took his hand. He pulled her up, and as she stood there, trembling in the middle of the kitchen, with apples rolling around their feet, Ilara realized something profound. The veil was still askew, and for the first time in 5 years, she didn't rush to fix it. The tin box sat on the heavy oak table. It was battered, the green paint chipped away to reveal the dull gray metal underneath. A soldier's kit. Silas sat opposite her. The kitchen was quiet now. The kettle had been moved. The spilled water wiped away. The only sound was the wind pressing against the glass, and the slow, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Ilara sat with her arm extended across the table. Her sleeve was rolled up. The burn was an angry red stripe across the back of her hand, glistening and hot. Silas opened the tin. Click. The sound was sharp in the silence. A pungent smell drifted up. Camphor, beeswax, and something sharper like whiskey. He dipped 2 fingers into a jar of yellow salve. "This will sting," he said. He didn't look at her face. He was focused entirely on her hand. He held her wrist. His grip was firm, anchoring her. His hands were massive. The skin was like leather, mapped with the history of hard labor. White scars from barbed wire, dark bruises from the forge, calluses that were thick and rough as bark. And yet, when he touched the angry red skin of her burn, his touch was lighter than a feather. It was a contradiction that made Ilara's breath catch in her throat. How could hands built for violence be capable of such gentleness? He spread the salve over the burn. It was cold, then hot, then numb. Ilara watched him. For the first time, she wasn't looking at the floor. She was looking at him. She traced the lines of his face with her eyes, the sharp angle of his jaw, the gray stubble, the way his brow furrowed in concentration. He wasn't wearing his hat. His hair was dark, streaked with premature gray, and slightly too long. "You said," Ilara started, her voice barely a whisper. Silas didn't stop working. He began to unwind a roll of white gauze. "I said a lot of things. You said you had a scar, from Shiloh." Silas paused. The gauze hung suspended in his hands. He looked up. His eyes were gray and distant, looking through her, looking back at a field of mud and blood 20 years ago. "A bayonet," he said softly. "Not a bullet." He began to wrap her hand. Over, under, pull tight. The man who did it was a boy. Couldn't have been more than 16. He was terrified. Silas's voice was flat, monotone. "I killed him." Ilara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty room. "I killed him, and then I sat there in the mud and watched him die while I held my own chest together." He tied the knot on the bandage. It was neat, professional. He sat back, resting his hands on the table. The skin healed, Ilara. The hole closed up. He looked at her, and the pain in his eyes was so raw it was hard to look at. But the part of me that was a man, the part that believed in goodness, that leaked out into the mud that day. He tapped his chest. This scar isn't the problem. It's the emptiness behind it. Ilara looked at her bandaged hand. Then she looked at her reflection in the window. The veil was still loose. She could see the twisted flesh of her cheek. I hid because I thought I was ugly, she whispered. You hid because they made you feel ugly, Silas corrected. He stood up. The chair scraped against the floor. There is a difference between being broken and being damaged. He walked to the stove and poured 2 cups of coffee. He brought one to her. He set it down near her uninjured hand. You're damaged, Ilara. Like this house. Like me. He took a sip of his coffee, staring out at the gray horizon. But damaged things are the strongest, because they've already survived the worst. He turned to leave the room. Rest that hand. No dough today. We'll eat stew. Ilara sat there for a long time. She touched the white bandage. She touched the warm ceramic of the mug. And then, slowly, deliberately, she reached up. She didn't pull the veil back down to cover her face. She unpinned it. The linen slid from her hair. It pooled on the table like a dead gray snake. She sat in the open kitchen, her scars exposed to the light, sipping her coffee. She was terrified, but she wasn't alone. Sunday mornings at the Stone Ranch were usually silent, a heavy, reverent kind of silence. The wind seemed to drop. The birds seemed to sing softer. It was the only day Silas didn't work the forge. He would sit on the porch, whittling, or cleaning his tack, watching the tree line with that eternal, vigilant gaze. Ilara was in the kitchen. She was kneading dough for the Sunday loaf. Her hand was still bandaged, the white gauze stark against the flour, but the pain had dulled to a throb she could ignore. She wasn't wearing the veil. It lay on the counter, a discarded shadow. She was humming, a soft, broken melody she hadn't realized she remembered. And then, the silence broke. Crunch, the sound of gravel crushing under iron-rimmed wheels. Snort, the sound of a horse blowing air through its nostrils. Ilara froze. Her hands stopped deep in the dough. The humming died in her throat. She looked at the window. A wagon was coming up the drive. It wasn't a delivery. It was Sunday. It wasn't a neighbor. Silas had no neighbors. She saw the driver, a man in a brown coat, slumped slightly in the seat, a bottle held loosely in one hand. Caleb, the man from the general store, panic, cold and electric, shot through her. She scrambled backward, knocking over a tin of yeast. Clatter. She grabbed the veil. Her fingers were clumsy, shaking so hard she couldn't find the pin. He's here, she whispered. He's here for me. She didn't run to the door. She ran to the corner of the pantry, the darkest shadow she could find, and crouched down, pressing herself into the wall. Outside, the wagon stopped. Hello, the house. Caleb's voice was loud, slurred. It carried the arrogant weight of a man who had been drinking courage since breakfast. Come on out, Silas. I brought some friends. There was laughter. He wasn't alone. Ilara squeezed her eyes shut. She heard the front door of the house open. It didn't bang. It opened with a slow, deliberate creak. Then, the heavy, rhythmic thud of Silas's boots on the porch planks. Thud, thud, thud. He stopped. Ilara could imagine him standing there, the giant on the hill. Turn around, Silas said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It cut through the morning air like a whip. Aw, come on now, Silas, Caleb jeered. We just came to pay our respects. We heard you got a guest. More laughter from the wagon. We want to see her. We want to see the face that scares the milk sour. Yeah, bring out the witch, another voice shouted. Ilara trembled. She pulled her knees to her chest. Go away, please go away. Get off my land, Silas said. Or what? Caleb challenged. You gonna shoot us all? For a freak? There was a sound. Click-clack, the distinct, mechanical, terrifying sound of a double-barreled shotgun being broken open, checked, and snapped shut. The laughter died instantly. I don't need to shoot you all, Silas said. His voice dropped an octave. I just need to shoot the first man who touches that gate. Silence. Absolute, terrified silence. The wind whistled through the porch railings. You got 3 seconds to turn those horses, Silas said. 1. You're crazy, Silas, Caleb yelled, but his voice cracked. You're protecting a monster. 2. Silas raised the gun. Ilara could hear the wood of the stock creaking as he pulled it tight against his shoulder. All right, all right. Panic. The sound of reins slapping leather. Yeah, go! The wagon jerked into motion. Wheels spun in the gravel. Horses whinnied in confusion as they were whipped around. You'll regret this, Silas, Caleb screamed over his shoulder as they retreated. The whole town knows. You can't hide her forever. We'll be back. The wagon rattled away. The noise fading down the hill is swallowed by the distance. Silas didn't move. Ilara listened. She waited for him to come inside, to tell her it was safe, but he stayed on the porch for 5 minutes, 10 minutes. She crept out of the pantry. She walked to the window and peeked through the curtain. Silas was sitting in his rocking chair. The shotgun lay across his lap. His eyes were fixed on the road. He wasn't whittling. He wasn't sleeping. He was guarding. The sanctuary had been breached. The outside world had found them. And as Ilara watched him, a dark realization settled in her stomach like a stone. The winter was coming, and it wasn't just the snow that would be trying to get in. The sky turned the color of a bruised plum. Then, the white curtain fell. It wasn't a gentle snowfall. It was an assault. The wind screamed down from the peaks, driving the snow horizontally, packing it against the stone walls of the ranch until the windows were nothing but squares of opaque white light. The world outside ceased to exist. There was no road, no town, no Caleb. There was only the howling void and the house. Inside, the temperature plummeted. The cold was a physical presence, a creeping invisible beast that seeped through the floorboards and under the doors. The kitchen, usually the heart of the house, grew frigid. The heat from the stove wasn't enough to fight the draft from the pantry. We close off the wings, Silas announced on the second day. He was wearing his heavy sheepskin coat inside the house. We keep the fire in the main hall. We sleep there. We eat there. It's the only way to save the wood. It was a command, but also an invitation. For the first time, the boundaries of their existence were erased. Ilara brought her bedding from the small room off the kitchen. Silas brought his from the upstairs master. They built a fortress of blankets and furs in front of the massive stone hearth in the living room. The fire roared, a defiant orange beast fighting back the white death outside. The intimacy was terrifying. There were no walls between them now, no doors to lock, just 10 feet of rug and the crackle of burning pine. Ilara sat on her pile of quilts, mending a tear in one of Silas's work shirts. Silas sat in his chair, oiling his revolver, the smell of gun oil mixing with the scent of wood smoke. Hour after hour, the clock ticked, the wind howled. They existed in a bubble of firelight. The snow is up to the porch roof, Silas said, breaking a silence that had lasted since breakfast. He didn't look up from the gun. We're buried. Ilara knotted the thread. Will the roof hold? She asked softly. The roof is stone and oak. It will hold. He paused. Will you? Ilara looked up. He was looking at her. Will I what? Hold. He gestured to the room, to the forced proximity, to the storm that trapped them together. I've been alone a long time, Ilara. I'm not easy company. Ilara looked down at the shirt in her lap. I've been alone in a crowd for 5 years, Silas. Silence is the only company I know. He grunted, a sound that might have been agreement. Night fell early, or maybe it didn't. It was hard to tell when the windows were buried. Ilara heated the stew in the cast-iron pot hung directly over the fire. The smell of beef and rosemary filled the small space. She ladled it into 2 bowls. Usually, she would take hers to the kitchen. She would turn her back. She would lift the veil just enough to slide the spoon in. But the kitchen was freezing, and the fire was here. She handed Silas his bowl. He took it. Their fingers brushed. She retreated to her spot on the rug, her back to the fire, facing the shadows of the corner. But the heat was intense. The fire was blazing just a few feet away. The wool of the veil, heavy and thick, began to itch. Sweat pricked at her forehead. The fabric felt like it was suffocating her. She looked at Silas. He was eating, staring into the flames, lost in his own thoughts. He wasn't watching her. Ilara's hand trembled as she reached for the pin. Take it off. The voice in her head was desperate. Just for a minute. Just to eat. She pulled the pin. The veil slid down, the air, cool and dry, hit her face. It was ecstasy. She felt the heat of the fire on her scars. It didn't hurt. It felt cleansing. She didn't turn around. She kept her back to him, her shoulders hunched and protecting her secret. She took a spoonful of stew, then another. She ate with a hunger she hadn't realized she felt. Behind her. The spoon scraping against Silas's bowl stopped. The silence changed. It wasn't the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of awareness. He knew. He knew the veil was down. He knew the monster was exposed. Ilara froze, the spoon halfway to her mouth. She waited for him to speak, to tell her to cover up, to tell her it was improper, but he didn't speak. She heard the soft clink of his bowl being set down on the floor. Then, the sound of a match being struck, the smell of tobacco. He was lighting his pipe. He was staying exactly where he was. He was giving her the only thing she had ever really wanted. Not pity, not praise, privacy. Ilara let out a shaky breath. She took another bite of stew, and as the wind battered the stone walls, trying to tear them down, Ilara felt the first brick of her own internal wall crumble into dust. The fire had burned down to a bed of pulsing, deep red coals. The room was dim, lit only by the dying glow that painted the stone walls in shades of copper and blood. The wind outside had changed. It was no longer a scream. It was a low, mournful moan, the sound of a storm that was tired of fighting. Ilara sat on the rug, her knees pulled to her chest. The veil was in her lap. She hadn't put it back on. In the semi-darkness, with the shadows hiding the worst of the details, she felt almost human. Silas was still in his chair. He hadn't moved for an hour. His pipe had gone out, the cold ash resting in the bowl. It wasn't a stove, he said. His voice startled her. It was quiet, rough, coming from the shadows like a thought made audible. Ilara stiffened. What? The fire, Silas said. He leaned forward, the leather of the chair creaking. The fire that did that to you. It wasn't a stove, and it wasn't a bakery accident. Ilara's heart began to race. I never said it was. No, you didn't. The town did. He looked at her. The red light of the embers reflected in his eyes. They say you fell asleep. They say you were drunk. They say you knocked over a lamp and burned down the miller's guest house. Ilara felt the old anger rise up, hot and suffocating. Is that what they say? She whispered bitterly. That's the story. And you believe them? Silas didn't answer immediately. He picked up a piece of pine kindling and tossed it onto the coals. It smoked, then caught a small yellow flame licking the wood. I believe, Silas said slowly, that a woman who cries when she drops a pot and who treats a burn with the precision of a field medic didn't start a fire because she was drunk. He looked at her. Tell me. It wasn't a command. It was an invitation to set down a weight she had been carrying for 5 years. Ilara looked at the fire. She watched the wood turn black and curl. It was the baby, she said. Her voice was hollow. The miller's son, Thomas. He was 2. She closed her eyes. They went to the governor's ball. They left me to watch him, but they didn't leave Cole. It was freezing. The nursery was like an ice box. She took a shuddering breath. I brought in the heater. The oil one. It was old, leaky. She paused. The memory was vivid, projected against her eyelids. I went to the kitchen to get milk. I heard the pop, like a gunshot. When I got back, the curtains were gone, the ceiling was gone, the crib was surrounded. She opened her eyes. She looked at Silas. I didn't think. I just ran. She touched her cheek. I grabbed him. I shielded him. I wrapped my shawl around his head and tucked him into my chest. I had to run through the wall of fire to get to the door. The beam came down, she whispered. It hit me. It pinned me against the burning frame. But I held him. I didn't let go. Tears leaked from her eyes, tracking through the scars. I got him out. He didn't have a scratch on him, not one mark. And the parents? Silas asked. They came home to the ashes. They saw their beautiful house destroyed. They saw their son in the arms of a monster. Ilara laughed, a broken, jagged sound. Mrs. Miller screamed. She didn't thank me. She looked at my face. The skin was peeling off, and she screamed that I was a witch, that I had tried to sacrifice him. It was easier to blame the maid than to admit they left a faulty heater in a nursery. She wiped her face angrily. So they ran me out. They told the story. and the story became the truth. Silence descended on the room. The log in the fire cracked. Silas stood up. He walked over to the mantelpiece. He moved a heavy iron candlestick and picked up a folded piece of paper that had been hidden underneath. He walked back to the rug and sat down. Not in the chair, on the floor, opposite her. He unfolded the paper. "I know," he said. Ilara blinked. "What?" "I went to the county clerk 3 weeks ago," Silas said. "I pulled the fire marshal's report from 1880. He tapped the paper. The marshal noted the faulty heater. He noted that the child was unharmed. He looked at Ilara, and I rode out to the next county. I found the doctor who treated you that night." Ilara stared at him, stunned. You investigated me?" "I investigate everyone who sets foot on my land," Silas said sternly. "I needed to know if I was harboring a criminal." He leaned in closer. "The doctor told me you refused morphine until you knew the boy was safe. He told me you never screamed. Not once." Silas reached out. His hand hovered in the air between them. "You aren't a monster, Ilara. You're a guardian, just like me." "And the town?" Ilara asked, her voice trembling. "Do they know?" "The town believes what makes them feel safe," Silas said darkly. "They need a witch to blame for their bad crops and their bad luck. The truth scares them." He tossed the paper into the fire. They watched it burn. The official record, the proof of her innocence, curled into ash. "Why did you burn it?" she gasped. "Because I don't need a piece of paper to tell me who you are," Silas said. He looked at the window, where the first gray light of dawn was beginning to bleed through the cracks in the shutters. The storm was breaking. "The snow is stopping," he said. His voice hardened. "And when the road clears, Caleb will be back, and he won't be alone." He looked back at her. "But this time, we don't hide. We prepare." The thaw sounded like 1,000 ticking clocks. Drip, drip, drip. The sun had broken through the clouds, a cold, brilliant white disk that turned the snow-covered world into a blinding mirror. Icicles hanging from the eaves began to weep. The water hit the wooden porch railing with a rhythmic, relentless cadence. Ilara stood at the kitchen window. She wasn't cooking. The dough lay flat and gray on the board. The fire in the stove had burned low. She was watching the road. The snowplow had come through the main valley hours ago, a distant mechanical roar that had cleared the artery to the town. But the driveway to the stone ranch was still a white, pristine ribbon, untouched, or it had been until 10 minutes ago. Silas was out there. He wasn't clearing the snow. He was moving the heavy oak wagon. He had dragged it, wheels locked and sliding, across the front of the porch steps. A barricade. He was piling sandbags, bags usually meant for flood control, onto the wagon bed. He moved with a dark, terrifying efficiency. He wasn't a rancher preparing for a visitor. He was a soldier preparing for a siege. Ilara wiped her hands on her apron. The flour left white streaks on the fabric, like war paint. She walked out onto the porch. The air was sharp enough to cut glass. It smelled of pine needles and wet earth. "Silas," she called out. He didn't stop. He heaved another sandbag onto the pile. Thud. "Go back inside, Ilara." "Why are you doing this?" she asked, though she knew the answer. "Maybe they won't come. Maybe the storm cooled their heads." Silas stopped. He leaned against the wagon, his breath pluming in the cold air. He looked down the mountain, toward the valley floor where the town of Oakhaven lay like a smudge of soot on a white sheet. "Fear doesn't cool," Silas said grimly. "It festers." He pointed a gloved finger. "Look." Ilara squinted against the glare. At first, she saw nothing. Just the trees, just the snow. Then she saw the movement. Dark shapes against the white. Small, distant, like ants crawling across a sugar bowl. They were gathering at the base of the access road. Not one wagon, not two. There were horses, riders, and a flatbed cart, the kind used for hauling timber or bodies. "Caleb didn't just drink whiskey during the storm," Silas said low. "He talked. He spun a story about how the blizzard was your doing, a curse brought down by the witch on the hill." Ilara felt her knees go weak. "They're coming for me," she whispered. "They're coming for what they don't understand." Silas corrected. He turned to her. His face was hard. The scar on his chest was hidden beneath layers of wool and leather, but she knew it was there. "Pack a bag," he said. Ilara blinked. "What?" "Pack a bag. Warm clothes, food, the small medical kit. You want me to leave? The rejection hit her harder than the cold. No, Silas said. He walked up the steps, the wood groaning under his weight. He stopped in front of her. I want you to be ready to run if I fall. He looked into her eyes. There is a trail behind the barn. It leads up to the ridge. It connects to the old mining pass. If they breach the porch, you go. You don't look back. I won't leave you, Ilara said. The words came out fierce, surprising them both. Silas's expression softened. Just a fraction. This isn't a debate, Ilara. It's a command. He brushed past her, heading into the house to get the ammunition. Ilara stayed on the porch. She watched the ants turn into men. The sun began to dip below the ridgeline. The brilliant white snow turned blue, then gray, then purple, and as the darkness rose up from the valley floor, the lights appeared, 1, then 3, then 10, torches, lanterns. They were moving up the switchbacks, a snake of fire winding its way up the mountain. They weren't hiding. They wanted to be seen. They wanted the fear to travel ahead of them like a herald. Ilara gripped the railing until a splinter dug into her palm. She didn't pack a bag. She turned and walked back into the kitchen. She went to the knife block. She pulled out the heavy butcher's cleaver. She tested the edge with her thumb. It was razor sharp. Silas had sharpened it for her just last week. She set it on the table next to the door. If they wanted the monster, they were going to have to fight the woman first. The orange glow of the torches didn't look like fire. Through the frosted glass of the front window, it looked like a living, breathing infection spreading across the snow. The chanting started low, a rumble in the earth. Burn it out, but it wasn't a human sound. It was the sound of a pack. Silas stood by the window. He had smashed the glass pane with the butt of his rifle an hour ago. The cold wind poured in, freezing the room, but he needed the clear line of sight. He rested the barrel of the Winchester on the sill. He was calm, terrifyingly calm. His breathing was slow, rhythmic, in through the nose, out through the mouth. He didn't look at Ilara. They're at the fence line, he said. His voice was flat. Last chance, Ilara. The back trail is clear. Ilara stood in the doorway of the hall. She wasn't wearing her coat, she was wearing her apron. In her right hand, she gripped the heavy butcher's cleaver. Her knuckles were white. I'm not going anywhere, she said. Silas didn't turn. He didn't have time to argue. Then stay low. If they breach the door, you swing that blade. You don't hesitate. You aim for the neck or the arm. I know, she whispered. Outside, the chanting stopped. A figure stepped forward from the line of torches. Caleb. He was holding a lantern in one hand and a bottle in the other. He swayed slightly. Silas, he screamed. The name tore through the night air. We don't want you. We want the freak. Send her out and we leave the house standing. Silas didn't yell back. He shifted his aim. Click. He cocked the hammer. You have 5 seconds to leave my property. Silas's voice boomed. It came from deep in his chest, amplified by the stone walls. She's cursed, a woman's voice shrieked from the crowd. She brought the blizzard. She'll kill the calves. Burn her. A rock flew out of the darkness. Crash. It smashed through the upper window of the bedroom. Glass rained down on the porch roof like hail. That was the signal. The mob surged forward. Light it up, Caleb yelled. 3 men stepped forward. They held torches wrapped in oil-soaked rags. They wound up their arms. No! Ilara gasped. Silas fired. Bang! The sound was deafening in the small room. The bullet didn't hit a man. It hit the torch in the first man's hand. The wood shattered. Sparks exploded in a shower of gold. The man dropped the burning brand into the snow and scrambled back, yelping in terror. Next one takes a leg, Silas roared. He worked the lever of the rifle, clack, clack, but the mob was too big. They scattered, moving to the sides, out of the fatal funnel of the front porch. They're flanking, Silas growled. They're going for the kitchen. He spun around. Ilara, the back door, barricade it. Ilara ran. She sprinted down the hallway, the cleaver heavy in her hand. She reached the kitchen. It was dark. Shadows danced wildly on the walls as torches passed the windows outside. She heard heavy boots crunching on the snow. Then, the handle of the back door rattled, violently. Open up! We know you're in there, witch! Thud. A shoulder hit the wood. The door groaned. The bolt held, but the frame cracked. Ilara backed up. She stood in the center of the room. Her heart was hammering so hard she thought it would burst. She looked at the reflection in the window. The veil, it was in the way, it cut her vision. If she had to fight, she needed to see. She reached up. With a savage, angry tear, she ripped the linen from her head. She threw it on the floor. She raised the cleaver. Thud. The door buckled again. A panel of wood splintered. A hand reached through the hole, groping for the lock. Elara didn't scream. She stepped forward. She swung the flat of the cleaver down onto the intruding fingers with all her strength. Crack! A scream of agony erupted from the other side of the door. The hand snatched back. "She's armed! The bitch is armed! Get the kerosene!" someone shouted. "Burn the whole thing!" Elara smelled it then, the sharp chemical stench of lamp oil splashing against the siding of the house. Then, a whoosh. An orange glow flared up against the kitchen window. They weren't trying to break in anymore. They were lighting the pyre. "Silas!" she screamed. "Fire! The kitchen is on fire!" Silas appeared in the doorway. He looked at the flames licking up the glass. He looked at Elara, standing there with her face exposed and the cleaver in her hand, her eyes wild but fierce. He didn't see a victim. He saw a soldier. "The water pump!" he barked. "Fill the buckets, I'll cover you." He kicked the back door open. The draft sucked the flames inward. Silas stepped out onto the back porch, right into the teeth of the fire and the mob. His rifle thundered. Bang! Bang! Back! Get back! Elara dropped the cleaver. She grabbed the bucket. She pumped the handle. The water flowed. She was throwing water on the walls, on the floor, on the flames that were trying to eat their sanctuary. She was coughing. The smoke was thick, but she didn't stop. She wasn't the girl who hid in the bakery anymore. She was the woman of the stone ranch, and she would burn before she let them take it. The gunshot echoed, rolling down the valley like thunder. Then silence, the kind of silence that rings in your ears. The mob had broken, faced with a man who wouldn't miss, and a woman who wouldn't run. Their liquid courage had evaporated into the cold night air. The torches were retreating, bobbing lights fading into the tree line, accompanied by the sound of frantic hooves and cursing men. The kitchen was a ruin of water and smoke. The back wall was charred black. The window was shattered. The floor was a swamp of freezing slush and soot. Elara dropped the bucket. Clang. The sound was small, insignificant. Her legs gave out. She slid down the wet wall, collapsing onto the floorboards. Her chest heaved. Her lungs burned with smoke. Her hands, raw and red from the freezing water, shook violently in her lap. She stared at the open door, at the darkness where the monsters had been. Silas stepped back inside. He kicked the door shut, jamming a heavy chair under the handle to secure it. He turned around. He was covered in soot. There was a cut on his forehead, blood trickling down to mix with the grime. He looked wild, ancient. He lowered the rifle, leaning it against the table. His chest was rising and falling in heavy, rhythmic breaths. He looked at the damage. Then, he looked at her, the adrenaline that had sustained Elara, the cold, hard rage that had allowed her to swing the cleaver, suddenly drained away. She was left with nothing but the shame. She realized, with a jolt of pure terror, that her face was bare. The veil was on the floor, trampled into the mud. The firelight from the stove was bright, unforgiving. It illuminated everything: the melted ear, the pull of the skin that twisted her mouth, the red, shiny landscape of scar tissue that dominated the left side of her head. She gasped. Her hands flew up to cover her face. "Don't!" she sobbed, the fight gone from her voice. "Don't look." She curled into herself, trying to make herself small, trying to disappear into the soot. "Don't look at me," she cried, her voice cracking. "I'm a monster. You saw it. You saw what I am." She waited for him to turn away. She waited for the look of pity, or worse, the look of tolerance. But she didn't hear footsteps walking away. She heard them coming closer. Thud, thud, heavy, deliberate. He stopped in front of her. He knelt down in the water and the ash. He didn't speak. He reached out. His hand, large, rough, stained with gunpowder, took hold of her wrist. He pulled her hand away from her face. She resisted. She kept her eyes squeezed shut. "No, please, Elara." He didn't let go. He reached up with his other hand. He placed his fingers under her chin. The skin there was sensitive. She flinched, but he didn't pull back. He lifted her face, forcing her to look up, forcing her to face him. "Open your eyes," he commanded, softly. Ilara opened them. Tears blurred her vision, but she saw him. He was inches away. He wasn't looking at her good cheek. He wasn't looking at her eyes. He was looking directly at the scar. He was studying it with an intensity that made her breath catch. He moved his thumb. He traced the line of the burn, from her jaw, up over the twisted cheekbone, to the temple. His touch was rough but reverent. "I don't see a monster," Silas whispered. He leaned in closer. "I see the fire that didn't kill you." He traced the path of the tear on her cheek. "I see the pain you carried for 5 years without breaking." He looked into her eyes. "I see a woman who stood in a burning kitchen and fought for my home." Ilara's lip trembled. "But it's ugly," she whispered. "It's broken." Silas shook his head. "It's a map," he said. "A map of survival." He moved his hand from her face to his own chest, over his heart, over his own hidden scar. "Perfection isn't about being unblemished, Ilara. That's just luck." He looked at her with a fierce, possessive pride. "Perfection is being broken, and still standing up." He wiped a smudge of soot from her forehead with his thumb. "You are the most perfect thing I have ever seen." The words hung in the smoky air. Ilara stared at him. The shame, the heavy, suffocating blanket she had worn for 5 years, didn't disappear, but it got lighter. It became something she could carry. She reached up, her hand trembling and touched the blood on his forehead. "You're bleeding," she whispered. Silas didn't smile. He didn't do smiles, but the corner of his eye crinkled. "I'll live," he said. He stood up, pulling her with him. "Come on, the fire is out, but the coffee is cold." He didn't let go of her hand. The sun came up over the ridge like a judgment, brilliant, unforgiving, white. It illuminated the scars on the land, the blackened scorch marks on the kitchen siding, the shattered glass glittering in the snowdrifts, the trampled mud where the mob had stood, but the house was still standing. The stone walls hadn't crumbled. The heavy oak timbers hadn't given way. Inside, the air was cold, but it smelled of coffee. Ilara stood at the stove. She was wearing a fresh apron. Her hair was tied back in a simple knot. There was no linen cloth draped over her head. There was no shadow hiding her face. She felt the heat of the stove on her left cheek. It felt normal. She picked up the coffee pot. She walked through the hallway, past the grandfather clock that was still ticking, steady and reliable. She pushed open the front door. Silas was there. He was kneeling on the porch, a hammer in his hand. He was fixing the railing where a rock had chipped the wood. He stopped when he heard her steps. He didn't look up immediately. He finished driving the nail. Bang, bang, bang. Then he turned. The morning light hit her face full on. It highlighted every ridge, every twist of the scar tissue. For a second, the old instinct flared up, the urge to turn her head, to hide. But she looked at Silas, and Silas looked at her. He didn't blink. He stood up, wiping his hands on his jeans. He took the mug she offered. "The town is quiet," he said. He looked down toward the valley. "They won't come back," Ilara said. It wasn't a question. "No." Silas took a sip of the coffee. "They won't. Men like Caleb, they only fight when they think the enemy is weak. They know better now." He leaned against the railing, his shoulder brushing against hers. They stood there in silence. Two outcasts on a hill, one with a face marked by fire, one with a soul marked by war. Ilara looked at her reflection in the window glass one last time. She saw the scar, but she didn't see the monster. She saw the woman Silas saw. She saw the woman who had walked through fire to save a child, and the woman who had walked through a blizzard to find a home. She took a sip of her coffee. The steam rose up, curling into the cold air, disappearing into the blue sky. "What's for dinner?" Silas asked, looking at the horizon. Ilara smiled. It was a crooked smile. The scar pulled at her lip, but it was real. "Stew," she said. "And bread, if you chop the wood." Silas grunted, a sound that might have been a laugh. "I'll chop the wood." He turned and walked down the steps toward the woodpile. Ilara stayed on the porch. She didn't look down. She didn't hide. She lifted her chin and let the sun warm her face. All of it.